Welcome to Board Certified, expert interviews on medical licensing exams and healthcare careers. I'm Cassandra with Achievable, and we offer adaptive online prep for exams like the USMLE Step 1, MCAT, PTCE, NPTE, and CSCS, all built to give you a complete study system in one place. Each course combines clear explanations, targeted practice questions that adapt to you, and full-length practice exams designed to reflect the real test. And you can try any Achievable course free at achievable.me and use the code podcast to save 10%. Now let's get started. Today we have Krissa Reeves with us. And Krissa, I'd love if you could introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you for having me. My name is Krissa Reeves. I'm a physical therapist assistant, and I also have a master's in education. So my history, I've been a PTA for 22 years. I also did a lot of instruction in the clinic and in a PTA program, and was a program director for a while as well.
Yeah, fantastic. So definitely an expert to be talking about today's episode. We are discussing the best study strategies for the NPTE, specifically the PTA. And so to start things off, what are some of the biggest concerns that students have when they begin studying? And then also, I imagine one of those would be when to start that study prep. Can you kind of walk through maybe what students should be thinking about as they prepare?
Well, I think one of the things that students, when you start to study, it's overwhelming. You're looking back and you're like, oh my God, I have to go back to the very beginning. 2 years of education. How do I study all of this for one test? And that can be, it's a very overwhelming feeling. And I think students can get very anxious. And like you said, it's like, how do you start? What's the plan? And setting a plan for study is very important. You can't just be like, oh, I'm going to study on the weekends, or I'm going to study after class or when I get home from work. You need to be very deliberate about your studying. Set a schedule. I always recommend to students that they start, depending on when they want to take their exam. There are fixed test dates for the NPTE in April and July, and then tend to be the ones that most students go for. April tends to be what we consider an early test date because a lot of PTAs are still in school. So July is probably the most common one. And you really need to look at your overall schedule. And you should be looking at what your testing schedule is going to be probably a good 6 months in advance. And not saying you necessarily have to hit the books hard then, but you need to set a plan. You need to build a schedule. And when I say build a schedule, actually look at the calendar and say, when do I have time to study? I know that I have classes here. I have work here. I have a planned family vacation here. Where am I going to build in my study time? And it can make it more manageable then. And you set that plan, you set that calendar, and it's less overwhelming.
Yeah, definitely. And I think you touched on something that's really important, which might seem obvious, but you do have to plan ahead and you do have to take it seriously. Like, you have to understand that there will probably be some sacrifices in order for you to prepare for this exam. It's
Yeah.
very high stakes.
And it's a lot of money.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
it's a lot of money to take these board exams. And so obviously not everyone passes the first time, but your goal is to pass that first time. And so the other really big part of that not only is planning your study, like when you're going to study, but also when are you going to take practice tests? Because taking those practice tests is what really tells you, am I ready to test? Am I not ready to test? And you do have the option to delay your test date with the NPTE. If you're not getting the scores that you need on your practice tests, then you should delay. And then you should take the test when the data is showing that you're ready.
Yeah, exactly. And then
Mm.
I wanted to ask too, are there certain like content areas that you think students struggle with the most or maybe find the most challenging that maybe they should start with that? Or how do you recommend they kind of go about that?
So I typically recommend that right in the beginning, like the first thing you do is you take a practice test
Hmm.
before you even start. See where you fall on that practice test. See what your areas of weaknesses are because sometimes we don't know. Sometimes it's the stuff that we learned in the beginning of the program.
Hmm.
Sometimes it's the stuff at the end because we haven't used it enough. And every student some people do better in orthopedics and some people do better in neuro class.
Right.
And so it's hard to say the exact content. That's why I always suggest that students start with a practice test. Look at that because it gives you the breakdown, whether you're taking a practice test from a company or from the FSBPT. They have retired board exams that you can pay for and take. That gives you a good starting point, and then you can build your study plan from there. Because you don't want to spend a lot of time on the content that you got. If you really got it, then you don't need to spend as much time studying that. You need to spend time studying on the skills that are weaker, that are showing that, oh, I just don't quite remember this. Oh yeah, I remember struggling on that test in that class and I should really focus in that area.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you mentioned, it's going to vary by individual. It really,
It
you
it
can't
really
compare
does.
yourself to, your friend or your classmate. Like
Mm-mm.
it's a very unique personal thing. And I think what better way than taking a practice test to know what you should be focusing your study on. I think that's great advice.
Mm-hmm. And it's also good. So when you're done taking that practice test, you need to do a self evaluation and you need to go
Hmm.
through those test questions and say, okay, did I not get this correct because I just didn't know it? Is it just content knowledge and I need to study? Did I not understand what the test question was saying? Or did I not know? I knew that content, but I didn't know how to apply it to that test question. And that can also give you a good direction on how and what to study.
Yeah. Yeah, it really comes down to taking that kind of step further and analyzing your practice exam to really
Mm-hmm.
understand exactly what you said. Why did I get that question wrong? What was really going on in my mind? And, how can I improve from there?
And test fatigue is a big thing. People aren't used to sitting down and taking a 4 hour exam.
Hmm.
And and so we tend to see in those first few practice tests is that the last section tends to be their weakest, not necessarily because of the content, but because they're just tired. You're
Yeah,
just tired from
exactly.
taking a test that long. And so you just like any exercise, you got to build up your stamina for test taking.
Hmm. Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think that's something that's often overlooked because it seems like obvious, maybe, but
Mhm.
yeah, it's important to understand that aspect for sure. And then you kind of touched on it a bit when it comes to balancing your, exam prep with everything else you have going on in your life. Maybe you are working, maybe, you have coursework that you need to do. How do you recommend that, students can really find balance and be able to achieve their goals?
I think one is recognizing that this is a short time period in your life.
Hmm.
And it's if you can stick to a schedule like that and you can work through it. But at the same time, it is very important to take a step back. You can't just sit down and plan to study for days on end. You won't retain it. You're just shoving content in without any ability to retain it, to process it. And that's not going to come out in the test well. So like you said, finding that balance. You need to step back, you need to take breaks, but having the discipline to be like, okay, I've taken my break, I've gone out with my friends, I've had a weekend of fun, but now I have to get back to it. And because no one wants to study.
Of course. Of
Yeah, it's
course.
like, no, I've yet to meet a student who's, yes, I'm going to spend all my
Right.
time studying. Yay! And so if you don't give yourself those little breaks, you get so burned out on it that you end up just not doing it. And so it is, like I said, you got to schedule in on that schedule. This is a break day. I'm not going to do anything today. And that's really, it's important.
It's absolutely important. And that kind of takes me a little bit into my next question, which is okay, so you have done all the things, you prepared, you've taken the exam, and you didn't pass. So the first thing I want to ask is how do you kind of reframe your mentality? Because that can be really discouraging. And it feels almost like, oh, I have to, start from square one. And then how
Mm-hmm.
do you then prepare to retake the exam?
And you're right, it can be so discouraging, especially you see it with students who missed it by just a few points, and they're just like, oh,
Hmm.
yeah, what happened? What did I do?
Yeah.
But that is where that ability to self-assess your test comes in, because you will get a breakdown of your tests and you can see the areas of kind of like where you were strong, where you weren't strong. And at that point in time, after you've taken a little bit of a, you got to take a little time to just mourn the fact that you didn't
Yes.
pass on the first time.
Hmm.
But then you got to turn that thought process around to, okay, I didn't pass this time, but I can see I've gone back, I've looked at my test, and I need to study the intervention section better. Or I need to go back and take more practice tests because I got too tired. By the end of the test, I was just clicking because I just needed to be done. And then hit those areas as you start to study again. Um, and there are a lot of out there for programs to help guide you in your studying. And that can be very helpful as well, especially if you're finding that you're struggling to maintain that discipline to study. It can be very helpful to have an outside program that you're working with to kind of help guide that process a little bit better.
Yeah. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
definitely. And I think too, the biggest thing there is mindset. And like you said,
Yes.
take the time to sit in the devastation because it
Mm-hmm.
is, but
It
then,
is.
yeah. But then recognize that, okay, this is just another tool to
Mm-hmm.
understand where I'm at and where I can continue to improve.
It is. I've had students come back and who haven't passed the first time, and they say, I just freaked out. I got to it and the pressure got to me. I was meeting my test scores. I had done everything right and I just blanked. I got to that test center and I sat down and I just it's like everything flew out the window. And we've all been in those kind of situations where you're just like, "Oh my god, did I even study? Did I even prepare for
Mhm.
this?" That happens. And so then you have to say to yourself, okay, that happened. Now, how do I move forward? How do I move on from that? And that can be hard. That takes a lot of
Yeah.
grit. That takes a lot of to come back from it. So,
Yeah. That's such a
mhm.
good point too, because like you said, there's something shifts in your brain when you're taking all these practice tests. It's just not the same as actual
Cool.
test day. And I've even heard people recommend, like, simulate the test experience as
Yes.
best as you can, you know, time yourself and, maybe you're taking it not closed off in your room with no distractions. Maybe, I've heard people suggest take it in a library where it's quiet
Hmm.
enough, but there are maybe some distractions that might come up. And that's all great advice. but there is something that just like shifts in your mind the minute it's real. And
Yes.
that can be difficult to overcome. And dare I say, you might not overcome that. Like, it's not, you're not going to be like, oh, like, I'm totally comfortable here. But you can still kind of, you know, make it worthwhile for yourself and not let it impact your
And
performance.
recognizing that can happen. And I think a lot of students
Mhm.
know, especially at that point in time in their schooling career, if you will, they know if, oh, yeah, I hit that test and I get super anxious. Or when I'm put in this situation, it really, I start to worry and I start to question. So learning strategies to recognize that and then overcome it and saying, okay, I recognize that my test anxiety is really creeping up here. So I need to have some, okay, if I play with my fingers a little bit or something, can I get my brain off of the anxiety and be able to move forward? And I think people learning those, there's so many resources out there,
Mhm.
looking up
Yep.
test taking strategies and anxiety and finding what works for you.
hmm And I think that's something to point out too. Like, you are not the only one who
Oh, God,
is,
yeah.
having this reaction. Everyone. I would be shocked if I met someone who was like, that doesn't bother me one bit. And
Yeah.
I think that it just means you care, right? Like you have,
Yes.
a lot of, you know, there's a lot of stake in it, right? Like it's a big deal.
You've worked
It's a big
and
deal.
you've worked really hard for several years
hmm
to get to this point.
hmm
And s- PTA programs are tough. They're intense. So you've put so much of your time and your life into this process that it can be very overwhelming when you're like, "Oh my God, this whole test. This
Right?
is all my schooling wrapped into one. What am I going to do?" But that's, again, you just need to recognize that and be like, okay, I'm going to freak out, but now I'm going to go on.
hmm
So,
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Okay, great. Well, then the next thing I wanted to ask was, okay, yay, you finally passed. Now, like, what are the next steps that, students should be thinking about once they kind of have that pass in their hands, and are there any other skills that would be valuable beyond just, the exam knowledge?
oh, totally. You can never discount experience. Um,
hmm
and there's a reason why we call it entry level because you're coming into the profession at entry level. So you have the knowledge that you need to be safe, to do the interventions, but you don't have the history and the experience from past patients, past jobs to
Right.
know to always make the best choice at the right time. And yeah, you've passed your exam. You're ready to go into the clinic. Depending on what state you're in, you either can finally get a job or maybe you've been using a temp license and now you're practicing under your like a full license. But there are states that you can't even work until you pass that test. And so
Mhm.
that's kind of when you pass that test, you're like, woohoo, now I can
Yeah.
work.
Yes.
Um, so whether you're working and now you can move forward with a full license or you're looking for that first job, it's important to look for an employer who one recognizes that you're entry level, that you're going to need that mentorship. You're going to need that more seasoned clinician that you can bounce ideas off of, that can kind of support you in your own growth uh, as a clinician, because you need to be able to have that support system, or you're going to get into the clinic and you're going to get overwhelmed and you're going to not have the kind of the, how do I want to say that? It can be scary if you don't have the support system when you're very first practicing. I remember so my first job thinking, how did I trick them into hiring me?
Yes.
because because I was like, I don't know anything. But yet I had my degree, I had my license, and
Yes.
I had the right paperwork to show that I was ready to work. But in my brain, I was like, oh my God.
Right.
Oh.
Yeah. It's
Um,
intimidating.
it's very intimidating. And so you have those imposter syndrome feelings when you
Mhm.
first go out because you really think you're like, "Oh my God. Yeah, I have my license, I have my degree, but do I really know how to do this?"
Right.
And so having, like I said, having that mentor there who you can go to and be like, "My patient, I know I need to do this with my patient because they're showing these signs, but how do I do that?"
Mhm.
What's the right exercise for that? What's the right interventions? I was very lucky in my early career where it was myself and another and a PT, and we were one on one in the clinic. And I think at the end of every day, I sat down and I looked at my charts and I was like, so tomorrow I want to work on this for this patient. How would you go about doing that? And she was very
Mhm.
understanding. And it was like a year-long internship.
Yep.
That's kind of what I
Exactly.
felt like. But you need that when you're first out there and you should look for it. Um, and you should make sure that your employer will provide it. And they should want to because um that's how you build a clinician and you build that loyalty and trust in your clinics and you can keep your employees. You can keep them.
Yeah, exactly. And plus, you want to continue that learning, right? Like
Oh,
like you had
yeah.
mentioned, experience is the best teacher. So, what better
Uh-huh.
way than to help provide some of that teaching as well?
Yeah, and it's more than just continuing education classes. Yes, everyone has to do a certain number to renew your license. Um, Finding that clinic support, that person at your work that you can go to for that sort of immediate feedback is important because experience is more than just Con Ed.
Mm.
So,
Yeah, exactly. Well, great. Is there anything else that maybe we missed that you wanted to make sure we talked about?
not really. I think we hit a lot of the big components there. Like I said, it's you got to make a plan. You have to make a plan well in advance. They
Mhm.
say typically at least 12 weeks ahead. That's why I like to tell students start thinking about it 6 months before because you should really be hitting it firmly at 12 weeks, 12 weeks out, and make that plan. And if you're not ready, reschedule. Yes, you have to pay a fee, but there's a lot of data that supports that if you're not meeting your target scores on those practice texts, that you're not going to pass. So don't just wing it.
Exactly. It's in your own
Yeah,
best interest to do that.
it really
Yeah.
is.
Great. Well, thank you so much. This has
You're
been
welcome.
board certified, hosted by Cassandra from Achievable with Chris O'Reeves. And Achievable has great online courses for the USMLE Step 1, MCAT, PTCE, MPTE, CSCS, and others. And you can try them out for free at achievable.me.